The hardest part of losing everything isn't watching people walk away. It's realizing the only one who stayed was never human. Mason Hale sat alone in the parking lot, long after the courthouse doors had closed behind him. Rain tapped softly against the windshield of his aging Ford pickup, turning the world outside into a blur of gray lights and distorted shadows. At 68 years old, Mason had survived deployments overseas, sleepless nights in distant deserts, and years of rebuilding a life after military service. None of it had prepared him for what happened that afternoon. 34 years of marriage had ended with a stack of papers and a judge's signature. The house was gone. The savings were gone. The retirement investments he thought would carry him through old age were gone. Nearly everything had been awarded to his former wife during the settlement. Mason stared through the windshield without seeing the road ahead. His hands rested motionless on the steering wheel. For the first time in decades, he had absolutely no idea where he was supposed to go next. A soft nudge against his arm pulled him from the fog of his thoughts. Gunnar sat in the passenger seat, his large German Shepherd frame filling most of the space beside him. The dog's amber eyes never left Mason's face. Loyal, patient, unwavering, the same way he had been every day for the last 8 years. Mason managed a tired smile and rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Looks like it's just you and me now, partner." Gunnar's tail thumped once against the seat. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Mason started the engine and pulled away from the courthouse. He drove for hours without speaking. The city slowly disappeared behind him. Highway signs flashed by beneath dark clouds, gathering over the distant mountains. Every mile felt like another chapter of his old life, fading into the rearview mirror. By nightfall, he found himself parked at a lonely gas station outside a small mountain town. The place looked frozen in time. A single flickering light buzzed above the pumps. Mason stepped out to stretch his legs while Gunnar followed close beside him. The cold air carried the scent of pine and wet earth. For a brief moment, the quiet reminded him of somewhere he hadn't thought about in years. His father's cabin, hidden deep in the mountains, forgotten by nearly everyone. The property had been sitting empty for more than 2 decades. Mason hadn't visited since his father passed away. He had always assumed he would someday return. Someday had simply never come, until now. He climbed back into the truck and unfolded an old county map he kept tucked inside the glove compartment. His eyes found the familiar location almost immediately. The cabin still existed, at least on paper. Maybe it was falling apart. Maybe nature had reclaimed it entirely. But it was still there, the last place in the world that belonged to him. As Mason folded the map and prepared to leave, Gunnar suddenly stood up in the passenger seat. The dog's ears locked forward, his gaze fixed on something behind the seat. Mason frowned. "What is it, boy?" Gunnar remained perfectly still. Then he let out a single low whine. Mason reached behind the seat and froze. There, half hidden beneath an old blanket, sat a small weathered wooden box he had never seen before. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one. Mason kept staring at the wooden box, while Gunnar sat rigid beside him, eyes fixed on it, as if the dog had been waiting for this moment all along. The box was small, no larger than a hardcover book, its surface worn smooth by time. A brass latch held the lid shut. "You ever seen this before?" Mason asked quietly. Gunnar tilted his head but never looked away. Mason released a slow breath and flipped the latch open. The hinges creaked softly. Inside rested a yellowed envelope and an old metal key attached to a faded leather tag. Mason's pulse quickened. The handwriting on the envelope stopped him cold. It belonged to his father. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he carefully opened it. The paper crackled in his hands. "Mason, if you are reading this, then life has probably taken a turn neither of us wanted." Mason swallowed hard. The words felt like a voice reaching across decades. He continued reading. "There are things about this family that were never meant to disappear. If circumstances ever force you back home, there is something you need to find." Mason's eyes moved faster. Then they stopped. The bottom portion of the page had been torn away. The rest of the message was missing. "That is it?" he muttered. "You have got to be kidding me." Gunnar suddenly stood and placed his front paws on the seat, nose pressing toward the letter. Mason laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I know. Not exactly helpful." He turned the key over in his hand. The leather tag had only 2 faded letters stamped into it. F.H. Mason frowned. The initials meant nothing to him. Rain continued tapping against the truck as darkness settled over the mountains. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. "Looks like we are going home after all." By sunrise the next morning, the truck was winding along a narrow mountain road. Pine forests stretched across the hillsides. Fog drifted between the trees. Mason had not driven this road in more than 20 years, but every curve felt strangely familiar. Gunnar sat alert by the window, watching the forest pass by. After another mile, the cabin finally appeared. Mason slowed to a stop. Nature had nearly swallowed the place whole. Vines crawled across weathered boards. The porch sagged. Several windows were covered by dirt and dust, yet the structure still stood. "Well," Mason said quietly, stepping out of the truck, "it has seen better days." Gunnar jumped down beside him. The dog immediately began sniffing the air. Mason grabbed his duffel bag and walked toward the porch. The old boards groaned beneath his boots. He unlocked the front door with the spare key he still carried and pushed it open. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Everything smelled of age and forgotten memories. Mason took a few slow steps inside. Then Gunnar suddenly froze near the doorway. His ears stood upright, his nose lifted into the air. "What is it?" Mason asked. Gunnar let out a low whine and moved deeper into the cabin. He stopped beside the fireplace and stared directly at the floor. Then he began scratching at the wooden boards. Mason walked closer. Before he could say a word, a faint sound echoed somewhere beneath the cabin. A hollow thump, then another. Mason froze as the sound echoed again beneath the floorboards. It was not loud, but in the silence of the old cabin, it felt impossible to ignore. Gunnar scratched once more at the same spot near the fireplace and then looked up at him. "You hear that too, do you?" Mason asked. The dog responded with a short bark. Mason set down his duffel bag and knelt beside the boards. The wood was old but solid. He pressed his palm against it and listened. Nothing. For a moment he wondered if the sound had been his imagination. Then came another faint thump from somewhere below. "Well, that is not normal." Gunnar immediately lowered his nose to the floor and began sniffing along the edge of the fireplace. Mason grabbed a flashlight from his truck and returned inside. Dust covered nearly every surface. The cabin looked frozen in time. Family photographs still rested on a shelf above the stone fireplace. An old rocking chair sat in the corner exactly where his father had left it. Mason picked up one of the photographs. It showed him as a teenager standing beside his father outside the cabin. For a moment he smiled. "You always had secrets, old man." Gunnar suddenly barked again. Mason turned. The dog was now standing beside a narrow hallway leading toward the back rooms. "What did you find?" he asked. Gunnar walked forward, stopped, then looked back. Mason followed him through the hallway. Most of the rooms were empty except for old furniture covered in sheets. In the final bedroom, he found a rusted metal filing cabinet pushed against the wall. Something about it seemed strange. The cabinet was cleaner than everything around it, as if it had been moved recently, despite nobody living here for years. Mason pulled open the top drawer. Empty. The second drawer held old receipts and faded utility bills. The third drawer contained a single notebook. He opened it carefully. The first several pages were blank. Then he found a handwritten entry in his father's familiar script. "Some truths are safer underground until the right person returns." Mason stared at the sentence. "Underground," he whispered. "What does that even mean?" Before he could read further, several pages had been torn out. The remaining entries made little sense. Dates, measurements, symbols. None of it explained anything. Gunnar suddenly growled softly toward the window. Mason looked up. Through the dusty glass, he could see the forest beyond the cabin. The trees swayed gently in the afternoon wind. Nothing appeared unusual. "Easy, boy." Gunnar remained tense. Mason walked to the window and wiped away years of dirt. In the distance, parked near the edge of the property, sat an old pickup truck. His heartbeat quickened. The vehicle had not been there when he arrived. "That is strange." He stepped outside onto the porch and looked again. The truck remained motionless between the trees. A few seconds later, the engine started. The vehicle slowly turned around and disappeared down the mountain road. Mason frowned. Who in the world would be out here? Gunnar stood beside him, watching the road long after the truck vanished. Then the German Shepherd suddenly spun around and raced back inside the cabin. A second later, Mason heard a loud hollow crack from somewhere beneath the floor near the fireplace. Mason rushed back inside and found Gunnar standing near the fireplace, barking at a section of floorboards that now sat slightly lower than before. The old wood had shifted. Dust drifted through the air. Mason crouched beside the spot and pressed down carefully. The board moved under his weight. "Well, would you look at that?" he murmured. Gunnar immediately scratched at the edge. "Easy, boy. Let me see what we have." Mason disappeared into the utility closet and returned with a pry bar. The cabin creaked softly around them as the afternoon wind pushed against the walls. He slid the metal tool beneath the loose board and pulled. The wood lifted with a long groan. Beneath it was darkness. Mason aimed his flashlight downward. The beam revealed an empty space nearly 3 feet deep. "There is definitely something under here." Gunnar leaned forward, nose working furiously. Mason widened the opening and examined the cavity below. It appeared to be part of an old crawl space running beneath the cabin. Nothing unusual at first glance. Just dirt, support beams, and decades of dust. Yet something felt off. He climbed down carefully and swept the flashlight across the ground. Then he saw it. A symbol carved into one of the wooden supports. His heart skipped. It matched the strange symbol from his father's notebook. "You have got to be kidding me." Gunnar barked once from above. I know. Dad wanted me to find this." Mason traced the carving with his fingertips. Beside it were several faded numbers, measurements perhaps, distances, directions. Before he could study them further, a truck engine echoed faintly from somewhere outside. Mason froze. The sound was distant but unmistakable. He climbed out of the crawl space and stepped onto the porch. The mountain road below appeared empty. The noise faded after a few moments. "Maybe somebody got lost," he said, though he did not believe it. Gunnar remained focused on the forest. His ears stayed upright. His posture remained tense. The dog had sensed something since arriving. Back inside, Mason returned to the notebook from the filing cabinet. He spread it across the kitchen table beside the old letter and the brass key. Hours passed as he compared symbols and dates. Most of it remained confusing. Then one line caught his attention. Beneath a series of measurements, his father had written 4 words. "Follow the ridge marker north." Mason stared at the sentence. "Ridge marker?" he whispered. He had not heard those words in years. As a child, he remembered a large stone monument on the property line, nearly half a mile from the cabin. His father used to take him there during long walks through the woods. Gunnar suddenly stood and walked to the front door. He looked back at Mason and let out a short whine. Mason laughed softly. "You want to go now?" Gunnar's tail flicked once. "You really do not like waiting, do you?" The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the trees gold and orange. Mason grabbed his flashlight and jacket. "All right, partner. Let us see what Dad was trying so hard to hide." Moments later, they stepped into the forest. Neither of them noticed the distant figure standing between the trees, silently watching them leave the cabin. Mason followed the narrow trail through the forest, while Gunnar moved several feet ahead, weaving between towering pines with confident determination. The fading sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, the stone ridge marker finally appeared. It stood almost 6 feet tall, weathered by decades of mountain storms. Moss covered much of its surface. Mason ran his hand across the cold stone. "I remember this place," he said quietly. "Dad used to bring me here when I was a kid." Gunnar immediately began circling the marker, sniffing every inch of the ground. Mason examined the stone carefully. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed a faint carving hidden beneath the moss. His pulse quickened. It was the same symbol from the notebook and the crawl space. "You were here, Dad." He cleared away more moss and discovered an arrow carved into the stone. It pointed north toward a section of forest he had never explored. "Looks like we keep going." Gunnar barked once and started forward. The terrain became steeper as they climbed. Fallen branches covered the ground. Twice Mason nearly lost his footing. "You know, partner, most men our age would be sitting in a recliner right now." Gunnar glanced back without slowing. Mason laughed. I suppose that is your way of saying keep up. Nearly half a mile later, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of an old hunting shack. The roof had partially collapsed years ago. Nature was slowly reclaiming the structure. Gunnar stopped suddenly. His ears snapped upright. What is it? Mason whispered. The dog stared toward the shack. Then he walked directly to the front entrance. Mason followed cautiously. Inside, dust coated everything. Broken shelves lined the walls. An old wood stove sat in one corner. At first glance, the building appeared abandoned. Then Mason spotted something unusual. Fresh boot prints marked the dirt floor. Not old prints, recent ones. His expression darkened. Somebody has been here, Gunnar growled softly. Mason crouched beside the tracks. The tread pattern looked familiar, similar to the marks he had noticed near the cabin earlier that morning. Before he could study them further, a voice suddenly echoed from outside. You should not be out here. Mason spun around. Standing at the edge of the clearing was an elderly man wearing a worn flannel jacket and a gray baseball cap. His face looked weathered by years in the mountains. The stranger raised both hands calmly. Easy. I am not here to cause trouble. Mason stepped outside. Who are you? The old man hesitated. Name is Walter Grayson. I knew your father. Mason's eyes narrowed. Then maybe you can explain why somebody keeps watching my property. Walter's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked toward the forest behind them. Listen carefully, he said in a lower voice. If you found his note, stop searching. Mason frowned. Why? Walter took a slow breath. Because the last time your father got close to the truth, people started showing up who did not belong here. Gunnar suddenly barked and turned toward the trees. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the dark forest. The snapping branch had been small, but the tension in his face made it feel much larger. Gunnar stepped in front of Mason and let out a low growl. You know who is out there? Mason asked. Walter hesitated. I know enough to stay away. Mason folded his arms. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am giving tonight. Walter glanced toward the fading sunlight beyond the trees. You need to get back to the cabin before dark. Mason shook his head. Not until you tell me what my father was looking for. The old man sighed heavily. Your father believed something was hidden on this mountain. Not gold, not money, something bigger, something people wanted forgotten. What people? Mason pressed. Walter looked uncomfortable. That is exactly the question he kept asking. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The wind moved softly through the pines. Finally, Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I should not even have this. He handed it to Mason. The paper was old and yellowed. Across the top was a rough hand-drawn map. Mason immediately recognized the symbol from the notebook. It was marked beside a location deeper in the mountains. Where did you get this? Mason asked. Your father gave it to me 20 years ago. Walter lowered his voice. He told me if anything happened to him and you ever came back, I should give it to you. Mason studied the map. A red X had been marked beside a narrow ridge several miles north of the cabin. Why wait all these years? Walter gave a sad smile. Because you never came back. Gunnar suddenly barked sharply and turned toward the trees again. This time both men heard movement. Not an animal, footsteps. Brief, careful, then silence. Walter's expression hardened. You need to leave, right now. Come with me, Mason said. Tell me everything at the cabin. Walter shook his head immediately. No, the less I know, the safer I am. He stepped backward toward the trail. Listen carefully. If somebody is watching you, they already know you found something. Mason looked down at the map in his hands. Then why help me? Walter paused. Because your father was my friend. Without another word, he turned and disappeared between the trees. Mason stood silently for a moment. Then he folded the map and slipped it into his jacket. Well, partner, he said, looking at Gunnar. Looks like Dad left us another breadcrumb. The hike back felt longer in the growing darkness. By the time the cabin came into view, the first stars had appeared overhead. Everything looked quiet, too quiet. Mason slowed near the porch. The front door stood slightly open. He stopped instantly. That is not how we left it. Gunnar's ears shot forward. The dog moved cautiously ahead. Mason felt his pulse quicken as he approached the cabin. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. Then he noticed something lying on the floor just inside the doorway. One page from his father's notebook. A page that had not been there before. Across the center, written in fresh black ink, were 4 words: "Stop digging or walk away." Mason stared at the warning for several long seconds. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Gunnar stood beside him, muscles tense, scanning the darkness beyond the doorway. "Somebody was in here," Mason said quietly. He stepped inside and switched on an old lantern sitting on the kitchen table. The cabin looked almost untouched, but small details immediately caught his attention. One chair had been moved. A drawer near the sink stood partially open. Whoever entered had searched the place carefully. "You wanted me to find this, did you not?" Mason muttered as he looked at the message again. Gunnar suddenly walked toward the fireplace. The dog lowered his nose to the floor and began sniffing the area around the crawl space opening. "What is it, boy?" Gunnar scratched once, then twice. Mason knelt beside him and shined his flashlight into the opening. At first he saw nothing unusual, then a small reflection caught his eye. Something metallic rested against one of the support beams deeper inside. He climbed down carefully and crawled forward. Dust covered his jacket as he reached beneath the beam and pulled out a rusted tin box. "Well now," he whispered. The box was old but still sealed. He carried it back to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were several folded documents wrapped in oilcloth. Most were too faded to read clearly. One, however, remained surprisingly well preserved. Mason unfolded it slowly. It appeared to be a survey map of the mountain property dating back nearly 40 years. Several landmarks were marked in red ink. His attention immediately locked onto one location, the same ridge shown on Walter's map. That cannot be a coincidence. He examined the back of the document and found a handwritten note from his father. The message was short: "If you find this, trust the dog." Mason leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would write." Gunnar wagged his tail once as if he approved. The old veteran studied both maps side by side. Together they revealed something neither map showed alone. A narrow trail connected the ridge marker to an area beyond the northern cliffs. The location was not labeled, only a circle drawn around it. "What were you hiding out there?" Mason asked. The question lingered in the quiet cabin. Hours passed. Rain began tapping gently against the roof. Near midnight, Mason finally stood and stretched. "Tomorrow we go north." Gunnar immediately rose from the floor. "I know, you were going either way." Mason smiled for the first time in days. Then a sound echoed outside, not loud. Just the brief crunch of gravel near the porch. Both man and dog froze. Gunnar moved silently toward the window. Mason extinguished the lantern and joined him. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, he looked outside. A vehicle sat at the end of the driveway with its lights off. A figure stood beside it, watching the cabin. The stranger remained motionless for several seconds before slowly raising a flashlight and pointing it toward the forest trail leading north. The figure remained at the edge of the driveway for less than a minute before climbing back into the vehicle and disappearing into the darkness. Mason waited several more minutes before pulling the curtain closed. That was not a coincidence. Gunnar stood beside him, staring at the door. "No argument from you, huh?" The dog let out a quiet huff. Mason slept very little that night. Before sunrise, he packed supplies into a backpack, folded both maps into a waterproof sleeve, and clipped a leash onto Gunnar's collar. "We finished this today." The mountain air felt cold and sharp as they followed the northern trails shown on the maps. The forest gradually thinned as the terrain became steeper. By mid-morning, they reached the cliffs marked on the survey document. Massive rock walls rose above them. Mason stopped and looked around. According to this, something should be here. For nearly 30 minutes, they searched without success. Then Gunnar suddenly pulled away and climbed a narrow path hidden behind a cluster of evergreens. "Hold on, boy." Mason followed. The trail ended at a rock face partially concealed by vines. Gunnar began scratching near the base. Mason pushed aside the vegetation and froze. A steel door had been built directly into the mountain. Weathered, rusted, nearly invisible from a distance. "Dad, what were you doing?" The door had no handle, only a small keyhole. Mason slowly reached into his pocket and removed the brass key from the wooden box. His heartbeat quickened. "Please tell me this works." He inserted the key. A loud metallic click echoed through the stone. The lock opened. Gunnar barked excitedly. Together they pushed the heavy door inward. Inside was a narrow chamber carved into the mountain. Shelves lined the walls. Metal filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Dust covered everything, but the room remained dry and remarkably preserved. Mason opened the nearest cabinet. His eyes widened. Documents, property records, survey reports, old letters, thousands of pages carefully organized. Then he found a folder labeled with his father's name. He opened it and began reading. As the hours passed, the truth slowly emerged. Decades earlier, a large section of land surrounding the mountain had been quietly transferred through fraudulent agreements. Several powerful investors had used false records to take ownership of valuable mineral rights from local families. Mason's father had discovered the scheme while working as a surveyor. He spent years collecting evidence, but never trusted anyone enough to release it publicly. Instead, he hid everything, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone he could trust. Mason sat silently. "You were trying to protect people." Gunnar rested his head against Mason's knee. Deep inside the final cabinet, Mason found one last envelope, addressed directly to him. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was short. "Son, if you are reading this, then Gunnar found what I always hoped someone would find. Trust what is in this room. Use it wisely. And know that I never stopped believing you would come home." Mason lowered the letter, unable to speak for several seconds. Then Gunnar suddenly lifted his head and growled softly toward the open doorway. Mason turned. Fresh footprints had appeared in the dust just outside the chamber. Mason slowly stood and turned toward the doorway. The fresh footprints stopped just outside the entrance, but whoever left them was already gone. Gunnar moved forward, sniffed the ground, then looked back at Mason. "I know," Mason said quietly. "We are not alone." He carefully gathered the most important documents, sealed them inside his backpack, and took one final look around the hidden chamber. For years, his father had protected the truth. Now it was finally in the open. The hike back to the cabin felt different. The weight on Mason's shoulders was no longer grief or uncertainty. It was purpose. The next morning, he drove into town with Gunnar beside him and arranged meetings with county officials, property attorneys, and a regional newspaper that still investigated local stories. At first, several people seemed skeptical. Then they began reading the records, survey maps, ownership transfers, signed statements, decades of evidence. One attorney leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Mr. Hale, if these documents are authentic, this changes everything." Mason nodded. "They are authentic." Over the following weeks, the story spread across the region. Families who had lost land generations earlier were contacted. Records were reopened. Long-forgotten claims were reviewed. Several properties were eventually returned to their rightful owners through legal settlements. The mountain community began talking about Mason's father in a very different way, not as a quiet surveyor who disappeared from public life, but as a man who had spent years protecting evidence until the right time. One afternoon, Mason sat on the porch of the old cabin watching the sun settle behind the mountains. The property no longer felt abandoned. Repairs had begun. Fresh paint covered the walls. New windows reflected the golden light. Gunnar lay beside him, content and relaxed. A pickup truck rolled up the driveway. Walter Grayson stepped out carrying a small wooden crate. "Thought you might want this," he said. Mason opened the crate and found several old photographs of his father, along with letters from families whose land had been restored. One note sat on top: "Thank you for finishing what he started." Mason read the message twice before placing it carefully back inside. "He should be the one getting thanked," Mason said. Walter smiled. "Maybe, but you were the one who came home." After Walter left, Mason remained on the porch for a long time. The mountains were quiet, peaceful, the way he remembered them as a boy. He looked down at Gunnar and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Looks like you were right all along, partner." Gunnar lifted his head proudly. Mason laughed. "Yeah, I know. You do not need me to tell you that." Months earlier, he had arrived with nothing except a broken heart, an old truck, and a loyal dog. Now he had something far more valuable than money. He had answers. He had purpose. He had a home again. As the last light faded across the ridge, Gunnar suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the porch, his ears tilted toward the distant forest. Mason followed his gaze. Far beyond the trees, something metallic reflected a brief flash of sunlight. Just for a second, then it disappeared. Mason smiled and shook his head. "Another secret?" Gunner answered with a single sharp bark. The old veteran leaned back in his chair and watched the mountains grow dark, knowing that whatever waited out there, he would never have to face it alone. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.